On a quiet afternoon, the royal guard stood in his usual position outside the historic site, his red uniform glistening in the sunlight. The royal guards are known for their perfect discipline, their stoic demeanor never wavering no matter what happens around them. Their duty is to protect and uphold the honor of the monarchy, and this particular guard took his job very seriously. The atmosphere around him was calm, and the site was a popular tourist destination, with people coming from all over to see the iconic guards in action. Most people simply admired the discipline and silence of the guards. But today, things were about to change. In the distance, a man with a dog was seen approaching the area. At first, he appeared to be just another tourist, walking casually down the street. However, something was different about this man. His body language was tense, and his eyes scanned the area with a sense of hostility. His dog, a large and muscular breed, was by his side, walking just ahead of him, leading the way as if it knew exactly where it was going. The man's face twisted into a sneer as he walked closer to the royal guard, his posture becoming more rigid and aggressive. As the man reached the front of the guard, he stopped and stood for a moment, staring at the soldier. People walking by noticed the strange tension in the air and glanced around uneasily. The man was clearly angry, though no one could yet understand the cause of his frustration. His dog, sensing its owner's mood, began to bark loudly, its tail stiff with excitement. Without warning, the man raised his voice and shouted something offensive toward the guard. The words were hateful and directed at the soldier's role as a royal protector, mocking the very duty he was assigned to. Passers-by froze, unsure of how to react, as the situation seemed to escalate quickly. The dog, now on alert, started to bark even more furiously. It was as if the animal could sense its owner's growing anger and had become an extension of it, reacting violently without knowing why. The royal guard, standing still as a statue, didn't flinch. His eyes remained forward, and his posture remained perfect. He had seen all kinds of behaviors from the public during his time standing guard, but something about this man felt different. He could feel the tension growing in the air, and he knew the situation was about to become dangerous. Still, he refused to break from his training, keeping his body straight and his focus on the task at hand. The man, now fully in rage, shouted louder and started waving his arms. His dog, encouraged by the chaos, charged forward, its eyes fixed on the guard. The crowd began to stir nervously, some people taking steps back, while others started to pull out their phones, preparing to record what they assumed would be a dangerous confrontation. But the guard remained calm. His eyes never left the dog as it approached, but his body did not move, and his face showed no emotion. The dog, now only a few feet away, stopped for a brief moment. The guard's training kicked in. He knew exactly how to handle this. He could feel the tension rising, but he kept his breathing steady. Everyone around was waiting for something to happen, some kind of reaction. But instead of reacting with fear or aggression, the guard stood his ground. The dog paused, looking up at the royal guard, unsure of what to do next. It was a moment of stillness amidst the chaos, and no one could have predicted what would happen next. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. The guard's stoic presence had already begun to change the dynamics of the situation. Something incredible was about to happen. The dog, still barking and growling, began to inch closer to the royal guard. Its muscles were tensed, its teeth showing as it was ready to lunge at the soldier. The crowd stood frozen, their eyes locked on the intense scene unfolding before them. The man stood behind the dog, continuing to shout at the guard, encouraging the animal to attack. The royal guard, however, stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the dog's every movement. He could feel the dog's presence growing closer, but he did not flinch, nor did he move a muscle. His hands were still by his sides, his body perfectly aligned, showing no sign of fear. The man's anger was evident, his words louder now. But the royal guard remained composed. He had been trained to handle situations like this, to face any danger with the utmost discipline and control. In that moment, the guard knew that reacting with aggression would only make the situation worse. The man was trying to provoke him, but the guard was determined not to give in. As the dog came closer, its bark echoing in the quiet surroundings, the royal guard's calm presence began to have an effect. The dog paused once again, its attention split between its owner and the soldier standing still. For a brief second, the animal seemed confused, unsure of what to do. It was as if the dog, sensing the steady resolve of the guard, wasn't sure how to proceed. The man shouted again, his voice trembling with frustration, but his dog wasn't reacting as aggressively as before. The crowd, now fully aware of the tension in the air, began to whisper amongst themselves. They had expected the guard to react, maybe to raise his weapon or even shout at the man. But instead, he just stood there, unwavering. Some of the onlookers were even starting to feel the power in his calm demeanor. They could see that the guard wasn't intimidated. In fact, he was in complete control of the situation, simply by not reacting to the provocation. The man, now realizing that his anger wasn't causing the reaction he had hoped for, began to walk closer to the guard. His eyes locked on him with hate. He shouted once more, but his voice cracked, his authority slipping. The dog, who had been growling only moments before, now seemed uncertain, its body stiff but no longer advancing. The dog's eyes moved from the man to the guard, trying to figure out the source of this strange power it was sensing. The royal guard had not moved a muscle, but in that moment, he made a subtle shift. He slightly adjusted his posture, standing even taller, and his eyes, while still focused on the dog, softened just enough to show a calm assurance. It wasn't a challenge. It was simply a quiet assertion of control. The dog, sensing this subtle change, took a step back, as if unsure about continuing the attack. The crowd, now watching in complete silence, began to realize that this wasn't going to escalate into violence. There was something remarkable about how the guard was handling the situation. The anger and chaos that the man had tried to stir up seemed to dissipate in the face of the guard's unshakable calmness. The dog, still wary, continued to observe the guard, but it no longer seemed intent on attacking. The man, still standing behind his dog, looked from the animal to the guard, a look of confusion crossing his face. His previous confidence seemed to falter, his body language no longer matching the aggression he had shown earlier. The situation had turned, and the guard's calmness had worked like a shield, neutralizing the potential for violence without a single word or aggressive move. The crowd began to whisper in awe, watching as the royal guard continued to stand firm and unflinching. It was a silent victory, but one that everyone could feel in the air. The man's bravado had failed, and now the situation had lost its edge. The royal guard continued to stand tall and unyielding, the perfect image of control and authority. The tension that had once filled the air slowly began to fade. The crowd, still holding their breath, watched as the dog, once so aggressive, started to calm. Its body, once stiff with hostility, now showed signs of confusion. The guard's unwavering stance, his calm and steady gaze, had a powerful effect on the animal. It wasn't the force of the guard's actions, but the sheer presence of his composure that had turned the tide. The man, on the other hand, was growing increasingly frustrated. He had expected the guard to react in a way that would justify his anger, but instead, the soldier stood completely still, giving him nothing. His words seemed to have lost their power, and his dog, which he had set loose to attack, was no longer responding the way he wanted. The man tried to command the dog once more, his voice laced with irritation, but the dog barely acknowledged him. It was as if the dog had realized something that the man hadn't yet understood. This situation wasn't going to unfold the way he had imagined. As the dog took a few steps back, still looking from the guard to its owner, the man's own frustration grew. He paced back and forth, still trying to get the dog to move forward, but the animal was now hesitant. The man's attempts were in vain. His anger flared, and he started shouting louder, trying to intimidate the dog back into action. But it wasn't working. The dog was no longer acting out of aggression, but rather out of confusion. It had no clear target, no clear command to follow. The guard had turned the tables with nothing more than his presence and discipline. The crowd, now realizing that the situation was under control, started to feel a sense of relief. There was no chaos, no violence. Instead, there was a calm that had taken over, and it was clear that the Royal Guard was the reason for it. People began to murmur among themselves, impressed by the guard's restraint and strength. It wasn't easy to stay calm in such a situation, but the guard had done it effortlessly. He had proven that strength didn't have to come from violence, and that composure could win over any challenge. As the dog finally backed away, the man took a step forward, his face reddening with anger and embarrassment. He was no longer the source of attention, and that seemed to frustrate him even more. The guard remained calm, his eyes never leaving the dog, but his body remained still. It was as though he was saying, without speaking a word, "You can try all you want, but I will not be moved." The man, realizing that his efforts were futile, finally stopped shouting. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time since the altercation began, the tension in his body loosened. The dog, now standing quietly beside him, looked up at the guard one last time. The animal seemed almost to be contemplating the situation, as if it understood the shift in power. The guard's stillness had conveyed a message to the dog. Aggression wouldn't work here. Slowly, the dog stopped growling and let out a small whimper, retreating behind its owner. It was clear now that the dog wasn't interested in pursuing the fight anymore. The man, now silent and defeated, looked around. His earlier bravado had completely evaporated. He was no longer the focal point of attention. The crowd, which had once been anxious, now seemed to be at ease. No one had expected the situation to resolve itself in this way, but the Royal Guard's calm had spoken louder than any words or actions could. It had made clear that sometimes the best way to handle aggression wasn't to fight back, but to remain composed and unmoved. The guard's presence alone had de-escalated what could have been a dangerous confrontation. As the man walked away, his head hung low, the crowd dispersed, quietly discussing what had just happened. Many of them felt a newfound respect for the guard, not just for his role, but for the calm strength he had shown. It was a reminder to everyone that power didn't always need to be loud. Sometimes, the most powerful thing a person could do was to stay silent, stay calm, and stay true to their purpose. The Royal Guard had shown that true strength comes not from reacting to chaos, but from remaining calm in the face of it. As the tension in the air slowly began to dissipate, the Royal Guard stood unwavering, still as a statue. The man, having finally realized that his attempts at provocation had failed, let out a frustrated sigh and turned away. His dog, now standing quietly by his side, followed him, the earlier aggression replaced by a strange sense of calm. The crowd that had gathered around began to disperse as well, some still talking in hushed voices, others simply relieved that the situation hadn't escalated further. The Royal Guard, however, remained in his position, his expression still as stoic as ever. He had not moved a single step from his post, and he wasn't going to. His job was to stand guard, to maintain order, no matter what disturbances came his way. The situation had tested his patience, but he had passed that test with a calmness that left everyone in awe. It wasn't just his training that had helped him stay composed. It was his unwavering sense of duty that had kept him grounded throughout the ordeal. As the minutes passed, the area began to return to normal. The tourists who had been watching the scene unfold began to go back to their sightseeing, though many of them couldn't stop talking about what they had just witnessed. Some were amazed by the Royal Guard's strength and discipline, while others were just glad that everything had settled down without anyone getting hurt. But one thing was certain: the guard had made an impression on everyone who had seen him handle the situation. For the people in the crowd, it was clear that the Royal Guard was not just there to protect a building or a monument. He was a symbol of something far more important. He represented the strength and resilience of those who dedicated themselves to their duty, no matter how difficult or challenging it might be. His calmness in the face of provocation had shown the crowd that true strength didn't always have to be loud or violent. Sometimes, the greatest power came from remaining composed, even when everything around you seemed to be falling apart. As the royal guard stood still, one young woman in the crowd couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration. She had been watching the entire scene unfold, her heart racing as the dog had charged toward the guard. But as the minutes passed, she realized that the guard hadn't been afraid at all. He had stood his ground, confident and unfazed. She felt inspired by his calmness, something she had never expected from a situation that had seemed so dangerous at first. The guard had managed to neutralize a volatile situation simply by staying calm. His actions had not been flashy or dramatic, but they had been effective. He had taught the crowd an important lesson. When faced with aggression, you didn't always have to fight back. Sometimes, the most powerful response was to remain calm, stand your ground, and let your presence speak for itself. As the crowd scattered and the area returned to its usual rhythm, the royal guard's posture remained as firm and proud as it had been at the beginning. He was once again just another figure in the background of the bustling scene, but for those who had witnessed what had just happened, he was far from ordinary. He had shown them that even in the most challenging of moments, composure and self-control could turn the tide. The lesson would stay with them. And for some, it would serve as a reminder of the power of calm strength, a lesson that would resonate long after the day had ended. The scene had quieted, and the once tense atmosphere had softened into something more peaceful. The royal guard remained standing in his place, still as ever, his posture straight and commanding. It was as if nothing had happened. His unwavering composure had not only diffused a potentially dangerous situation, but also left everyone around him in awe of his discipline. As the crowd began to disperse, the onlookers couldn't help but talk about what they had just witnessed. People continued to whisper to one another, sharing their admiration for the guard's calm and steady approach to the situation. Some of the tourists who had been watching the exchange were particularly struck by the guard's ability to stay focused under pressure. They had all expected a dramatic resolution, maybe even a confrontation. But instead, the guard had acted with such quiet strength that it seemed almost surreal. They had seen the man with the dog provoke the guard, and they had seen the dog grow more and more aggressive. Yet, despite all the tension, nothing had escalated into violence. The royal guard had simply remained in his post, and through his stillness, he had managed to take control of the situation. One elderly woman, who had been watching the entire ordeal from the sidelines, turned to her granddaughter, who had been holding her hand tightly the entire time. The woman, with a smile on her face, leaned down and whispered, "Sometimes, the strongest person is the one who knows when to stay still." Her words were simple, but they carried a deep truth that resonated with everyone who had witnessed the event. The young girl nodded, her wide eyes still reflecting the amazement she felt at the guard's composure. Meanwhile, the man with the dog had disappeared from sight. His earlier fury had been replaced by a sense of embarrassment, as if he now realized how his actions had failed to provoke any response from the guard. The situation had shifted entirely. The guard had not only diffused the tension, but had also made the man feel small and powerless in the face of his quiet strength. The dog, once so aggressive, had also calmed down, walking silently beside its owner as they both left the area. In the midst of this, the royal guard didn't acknowledge the crowd or show any sign that he had even noticed the commotion. It was as if he was simply carrying out his duty as he always had, stoic, unwavering, and unshaken. It was a testament to his training, his dedication, and the unwavering focus that was expected of someone in his position. But to those who had watched, it felt like so much more than just a job. The guard had shown them what it meant to be in control of oneself, even in the face of aggression. The lesson that the royal guard had imparted was clear. Strength wasn't just about power or force. It was about the ability to remain calm, composed, and true to one's purpose. The ability to stand firm, even when the world around you was chaotic, was a strength that not everyone possessed. The guard had demonstrated that true power came not from responding to anger with anger, but from facing it with control and confidence. As the day wore on, the event slowly faded into the background of the bustling city. The tourists who had been there that afternoon would likely move on to other attractions, but the memory of what had happened would stay with them. For many, it had been a lesson in the power of calmness and restraint. For others, it had been a reminder of the quiet strength that can be found in the most unexpected places. The royal guard, standing there in his unyielding silence, had left an impression that would not be easily forgotten. As the man with the dog walked away, his head low in defeat, the atmosphere around the royal guard began to feel different. What had started as a tense and potentially dangerous situation had slowly morphed into a quiet reflection on what had just happened. The crowd that had gathered to witness the scene began to shift, too. Some were still looking back at the guard with a sense of awe, while others were starting to talk amongst themselves, sharing their thoughts on what they had just seen. For the first time, the royal guard's actions were being discussed with respect and admiration. People who had never given much thought to the guards standing silently at their posts were now recognizing the depth of their role. The guard's ability to stay calm in such a high-pressure situation had made a lasting impression. It was as though everyone around him had just witnessed a masterclass in patience and strength. No one had expected the situation to unfold like this. They had anticipated chaos, shouting, and perhaps even violence, but instead they saw a man who refused to be moved by aggression, standing tall and confident without raising a hand. The young woman from the crowd, who had been watching closely, couldn't stop thinking about what she had just witnessed. She had been so sure that the situation would end badly, that the dog would bite, or that there would be a confrontation between the man and the guard. But instead, she saw something entirely different: control. The guard's presence alone had done what words and force could never have accomplished. He had not just controlled the dog or the man. He had controlled the situation, leaving no room for fear or violence to take root. As she walked away, she found herself still thinking about the guard's calm. It was a powerful reminder that in life, we often had the choice to react with anger or to stay composed. She realized that it wasn't always the loudest or the most forceful person who won. It was the one who could control their emotions and stay true to their purpose. The royal guard, with his calm and steady resolve, had shown her that strength wasn't just about responding to challenges with aggression. It was about holding your ground with confidence and dignity. The crowd, now scattered and returning to their daily routines, carried with them a new respect for the royal guard. The event had reminded them all of something important. Real strength often comes from within. It wasn't about how fast you could act or how loud you could shout. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you could do was simply stand firm and not let the world sway you. The guard had shown them all that, without saying a single word. Meanwhile, the royal guard, ever the professional, continued his duty as if nothing had happened. He didn't seek praise or recognition. His job was to protect, and that was exactly what he had done. His stillness, his calm, his unwavering presence, these had been his tools, and he had used them masterfully. He had faced a challenging situation and turned it into a lesson in strength and composure. And though no one had ever expected the situation to unfold as it did, the guard had turned what could have been a moment of chaos into a moment of clarity for everyone who had witnessed it. As the day came to an end, the tourists continued to visit the site, snapping photos and enjoying the scenery. But some of them couldn't help but glance back at the royal guard, still standing tall in his post, knowing that what they had seen was something rare and valuable. It was a moment they would remember for a long time, not just for the spectacle of it, but for the deeper lesson it had imparted. The true power of calm strength had left an indelible mark on their hearts. As the day continued, the event slowly started to fade from the minds of the people in the area. But for some, the memory of the royal guard's actions stayed with them. The tourists who had been present during the incident spoke about it in quiet tones as they walked away. Some mentioned how they had feared the situation would escalate, but the guard had handled everything with an unexpected calmness. It had been an eye-opening experience for many of them. They had expected chaos, perhaps even violence, but instead they witnessed something much more profound: strength in silence. For the people who had been observing, it was a reminder that situations didn't always need to spiral out of control. They didn't have to get louder or more intense. Sometimes strength wasn't about raising your voice or fighting back. Sometimes it was about standing firm and not letting the chaos change who you were. The royal guard had shown them this by doing nothing at all. He had simply stood his ground, unshaken by the threats or the anger around him. As the crowd dispersed, people began to go on with their day, but some found themselves reflecting on what they had just witnessed. The young woman who had been watching from the sidelines, for example, couldn't stop thinking about the royal guard's stillness. She had been unsure of what would happen at first, but now she admired how the guard had taken control without a single movement. The situation could have turned dangerous, but it didn't, because the guard had used his calmness as a shield. It was a lesson she knew she wouldn't forget anytime soon. For the people who had witnessed the man's outburst, there was also a sense of disbelief. How could someone be so angry over something so trivial? But what stood out to them was how the guard had handled the situation. The man had tried to provoke him, to force him into a reaction, but the guard had refused to give in. He didn't engage in the hostility. He didn't fight back with anger or threats. Instead, he just stayed still, his unwavering presence making the man's aggression feel meaningless. Even the few who had been unsure about the royal guard's role in the community began to see him in a new light. They had always thought of the guard as a figure standing there, doing his job without much thought. But now they saw something more in him. He wasn't just a symbol of tradition. He was a symbol of strength, control, and resilience. He had taken what could have been a violent and disruptive moment and turned it into a lesson for everyone around him. The area that had once been filled with tension had now returned to its peaceful rhythm. The royal guard, though still standing at attention, was no longer the center of the crowd's attention. People had gone back to their normal activities, but the impact of what had happened would remain with them. The guard had shown them that sometimes the greatest strength came from within, and that maintaining composure in difficult situations was more powerful than reacting in anger. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the historic site, the royal guard remained where he had been all day, unwavering in his duty. His calmness had turned a volatile situation into something much more. The tourists had learned an important lesson that day, one that they would carry with them long after they left. It wasn't just about how to handle aggression. It was about how to stay true to yourself, no matter what happened around you. And that was the real strength that the royal guard had shown, a strength that would never be forgotten. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets, the scene that had unfolded earlier began to feel like a distant memory. The royal guard, still standing at his post, was now surrounded by a quiet sense of respect. The earlier tension had melted away, leaving only the soft murmur of tourists and the gentle rustling of the wind through the trees. People moved about, but there was a new energy in the air, one of calm, almost as if the guard's presence had somehow influenced the very atmosphere around him. Those who had witnessed the altercation between the man and the guard, now returning to their sightseeing, spoke less of the drama and more of the lesson that had quietly unfolded. The young woman, who had been particularly struck by the guard's composure, found herself reflecting deeply on the experience. She had come to see the day as something more than just an unusual event. It had become a turning point in how she viewed strength. It wasn't about how loud you were, how much power you could show, or how quickly you could act. It was about how well you could maintain your integrity in the face of chaos. The royal guard had shown her that sometimes the greatest strength came from doing nothing at all, except staying true to who you were. As more people gathered around to take in the historic site, the royal guard's calmness became the subject of quiet conversations. A few tourists, Noticing how others were still talking about what had happened, approached with questions. They asked the locals about the Royal Guard's role, about his training, and how he was able to remain so composed. The locals smiled, proud of the professionalism their guards demonstrated every day. They explained that this kind of restraint and dignity was the essence of the guard's duty, not to simply stand at attention, but to be a symbol of peace and strength for those who saw him. It was a reminder, they said, of the power of silence and the strength of a steady presence. But for those who had been there, the moment when the royal guard had stood against the dog, and the angry man would not soon be forgotten. People who had felt unsure or even fearful during the confrontation now walked away with a newfound respect for the guard. They realized that this was no ordinary soldier. He was a person who embodied what it meant to be truly strong, not through aggression, but through the power of control and quiet authority. The man with the dog, too, had learned something. Though he walked away without saying a word, there was a subtle change in the way he held himself. His body language, once brimming with hostility, now seemed to slump, defeated not just by the guard, but by his own actions. He had tried to provoke a reaction, to make the guard lower his stance, but instead, he had been shown what it meant to stand firm in the face of anger and fear. The guard had taken control of the situation, not with force, but with presence. As the crowd slowly thinned out, the royal guard remained in his position. He had fulfilled his duty, but he had also done something much more important. He had left a lasting impact on those who had seen him in action. The lesson was clear. Strength was not always about physical power. Sometimes it was about remaining unshaken, even when everything around you seemed to be in turmoil. Nightfall came quietly, the sky painted with shades of pink and orange, and the city began to wind down. The tourists who had once been buzzing with excitement had now quietly processed what they had witnessed, each carrying a piece of the lesson with them. As the royal guard stood at his post, still silent and unmoving, there was a sense of calm in the air. It was as if the energy of the day, the chaos of the earlier moments, had been absorbed by him, leaving nothing but peace in its place. The royal guard had done more than protect a building that day. He had protected the dignity of his position, the power of calm in the face of aggression, and the idea that strength often lies in restraint. Those who had been present that day would never forget it, and in their minds, the guard's actions would be remembered as a quiet but powerful reminder of the true meaning of strength.